Let's bring in Arash Aramesh, a national security and foreign policy analyst, joining us via Skype this hour from San Francisco. It's good to have you with us. On what you just heard there, this being called political theater, what are your thoughts?
Unfortunately, this was a pretty sad day for the U.S. and Israel in the United Nations. President Trump decided to exercise his presidential power to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel, even though since 1995, Congress had recognized Jerusalem, but again, it takes a presidential action to do so, according to Supreme Court precedent. But the issue of Jerusalem becoming or recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel was always a final status issue, meaning all U.S. presidents, all presidents successively, from Carter and on, and even before that, didn't recognize Jerusalem because they wanted to say, or they wanted to use or sort of leave Jerusalem as the last bargaining chip. When the two sides, the Palestinians and the Israelis, finally reach a peace deal and the issue of East and West Jerusalem are settled, then the United States would go ahead and recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And as you know, we've had a sort of a large piece of property in Jerusalem for a U.S. embassy. We're paying $1 a year as sort of ceremonial rent to the state of Israel, but we've never started construction there because A, we knew that this was a final status issue, and secondly, it would alienate a lot of our allies and antagonize some of our key allies in the region, such as Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and so on and so forth, whose help, support, intelligence sharing, and military muscle we need in the fight against terror.
All right, as far as those allies are concerned, let's talk about the issue of U.S. foreign aid. That was also brought to the fore. America is the largest contributor to the United Nations Fund, contributing 1/5 of the UN budget. Nikki Haley spoke on that as well. Let's listen. We can talk about it here on the other side.
When we make generous contributions to the UN, we also have a legitimate expectation that our goodwill is recognized and respected. When a nation is singled out for attack in this organization, that nation is disrespected. What's more, that nation is asked to pay for the privilege of being disrespected. In the case of the United States, we are asked to pay more than anyone else for that dubious privilege.
All right, and as far as contributing to individual countries, I don't know if you can see this, but I'll show our viewers and tell you about this, the list of some of the top recipients, including Egypt, that helped to spearhead the vote Thursday. Looking at this, you see Iraq, Afghanistan, Israel, Egypt, as I mentioned. To the president's point, to the threat that's been put out there to cut funding, do they have ground to stand on?
First and foremost, the rhetoric coming from the White House and also from Ambassador Haley, unfortunately, the language is not one of strength and power. It's one of weakness. You analyze the words and the verbiage they use. It sounds like someone complaining that, hey, I'm spending all this money, but I'm actually getting the short end of the stick here. This is not very typical of U.S. ambassadors at the United Nations. Just for the sake of for the sake of argument, as an example, think about Stephen Atlee back in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The sort of strength and power and language and rhetoric he used to go after the Soviet ambassador, and compare that to the sort of position of weakness that the president and his ambassador, Nikki Haley, have sort of placed us at the UN. That's issue number one. Secondly, except Israel, every other country on that list, Afghanistan, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, Kenya, these are some of the largest recipients of U.S. aid. I highly doubt that the U.S. is going to cut funding to Afghanistan. I highly doubt that the U.S. is going to cut aid to Egypt, that is now in a huge fight with Islamist militants in the Sinai Desert. Same thing with Iraq. Same goes to Jordan. Today, Vice President Pence was in Afghanistan, making a new commitment that the U.S. is going to continue the war against the Taliban and the Haqqani network and radical jihadis in Afghanistan. So it's more empty rhetoric. And unfortunately, the world called President Trump's bluff. And that's why many countries, even those who dearly rely on U.S. aid. Egypt, Pakistan, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on and so forth went ahead and voted against this. On a sort of a footnote, but not an unimportant footnote, this issue has given rise to sort of regional players such as Iran and such as Turkey to once again take advantage of the Palestinian issue. Turkey is yet again trying to exert itself as sort of the Ottoman power and trying to be the leader of the Muslim world. We saw today that both the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and also the Turkish foreign minister, using some harsh rhetoric, talking about don't sell your values to US dollars. Again, trying to position themselves as the leader of the Muslim world. And by that, mind you, Turkey is a NATO ally, yet they are taking these harsh positions. Now, let's also put this in context. All these countries, India, Russia, Turkey, many European countries that voted against us today,
right?
They're not the ones who changed their position. While I definitely have some reservations when they criticize us about human rights issues, when the Venezuelans and the Turks, the Iranians and the Saudis criticize us about human rights violations. Having said that, again, it's not them who have changed this issue, the policy views on this issue. It's us. And unfortunately, the president and his foreign policy team have not done a good job selling it, justifying it, and now trying to minimize damage.
So you're calling it a bluff. You say it's a bluff.
It is. Unfortunately, it is, and they called it. And so speak softly and carry a big stick. This president does not speak softly, and his stick is not that big. And people do call his bluffs. And unfortunately, that has not been the first time. I don't see the president cutting aid anytime soon.
I want to pose one other question to you. We're a little short of time, but it's an important question. This is simply about Nikki Haley's claim that the UN has an unfair bias against Israel. Looking at the numbers, the current session of the UN General Assembly alone, there have been 21 resolutions on Israel, 6 on the rest of the world. So just given those numbers to this claim, do you see this as a valid argument?
You know, you can actually look at the numbers, not just this year, but the past 5 or 6 years. I think there's been more than 86 resolutions or 91 resolutions total at the UN Security Council, 70 some of which has condemned Israel. That is a pretty high percentage point focusing on one country, given that 500,000 people have been killed in Syria by a brutal 7-year civil war, given that hundreds of thousands of people have been uprooted and thousands killed in a genocide in Myanmar, the Rohingya, given that there is a daily human rights violations going on in modern day concentration camps in North Korea, given that human rights is almost non-existent in Saudi Arabia, and the list goes on and on and on. There is a valid argument there to be made. I give that to Nikki Haley. But again, the way to try to bring the world around to see our perspective and our point of view is not how they handled it. The U.S. is a global, and by isolating us, we're losing leverage and we're losing power and influence. And
I apologize for interrupting. We're a little short for time. Arash Aramesh, we appreciate you joining us, though. Thank you so much for your perspective. We have to push the show forward. Still ahead here, the results are in Catalonian.